Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode I have back on my friend Lauritz to talk about spirituality, Buddhism, meditation practice, answer some basic questions, give some tips and advice, and even kind of go a little deep into some of these concepts as well that would be interesting, I would hope, for not only beginners but for intermediate and even advanced practitioners. I had Lauritz on, I think almost exactly a year ago, almost a year ago, and I will link to that episode in the show notes as well if you want to listen to that after listening to this. There's no order necessarily that you need to listen to it in, but it is present, and I always like to link to a guest's prior appearances when they come on the show for people that just hear them for the first time in this episode. They can go back and listen to the catalog episodes. But this is a really fascinating, wonderful conversation with a really down-to-earth and insightful person, and we talk about the role of momentum in meditation practice, the cycles that one goes through when engaged in it, some tips and advice for people setting out on a spiritual or contemplative path of any sort. We talk about meditation, different aspects of it, and more or less just have a really wide-ranging and very interesting conversation. And I know this is something that is kind of unique about our platform, is that we have these conversations. We're obviously a left-wing political show primarily, but I've always got really good feedback when I've done these forays into religion and spirituality and Buddhism and meditation practice, and this is another installment of precisely that. So for those that are interested in those episodes, you're really going to get a lot out of this one. So without further ado, here is my episode with my friend Lauritz, who also has a YouTube channel called Conscious Development, which I'll also link to in the show notes. And we just have a wide-ranging discussion about spirituality, Buddhism, meditation, and more. Enjoy.
Thank you, Brett, for inviting me again to the show. My name is Lauritz Marquardt, and I started meditating 10 years ago, and the details of my path and how I got into it, as you just explained, can be found in our first conversation, which we had, I think, when was that? Maybe...
It was August of 2021, last year.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say, almost a year ago, yeah. Mm-hmm. Details about, as I said, how I got into it, people can find there, but quickly to say, I got into this mostly through psychedelic experiences, as I think many people in the West come at first in contact with this idea that there may be something more to reality than is visible from the surface that we operate on. And quickly when you do research at what the heck did I experience, you find something like Buddhism or spiritual traditions, and I quickly found out that there are practices to facilitate some deeper perspectives on life, and that's how I ended up really exploring meditation and sharing my insights along the way on YouTube, and how you found me and how we have now our conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so, that episode that we did previously a year ago is called Awakening from the Dream of Separateness, and I will link to it in the show notes. And again, that will go over a lot of Lauritz's, awakening experiences. We talk more about Buddhist philosophy in general, etc. So that's you don't have to listen to that episode first, but to get an idea of this guest and some of his background, you could do that, or you could listen to it after. But today's episode is going to just be more focused on covering some basic stuff within spiritual practices. Specifically, we're kind of operating within the Buddhist tradition, but, we can kind of even leave that tradition and expand outward, when it fits us to do so. But I thought this would be very helpful because, this is mostly, left-wing philosophy and history podcast, and a lot of my listeners are interested in this stuff, and I've gotten a lot of feedback saying we really like when you do these religious or spiritual episodes. It's very hard to find this anywhere else in the left-wing, media space in particular. So people are very interested in this, but a lot of people also have little to no experience in this whole realm. So I was hoping that this conversation could be helpful for people in that sort of position where you're new and interested and curious and are thinking about getting in. But I also think a lot of this stuff will be just as relevant and hopefully interesting for intermediate and even advanced practitioners of various sorts. So this is by no means going to be simply an intro, but I think it should be accessible to people all across the spectrum of experience. Yeah, so I guess the first way to kind of get into this conversation broadly, Lauritz, is to talk about my email that I emailed you recently about a feeling of plateauing in practice. And I kind of just reached out to you, and you gave me some very helpful advice. But that's something that I've been struggling with, over the last year or so, which is feeling very much as if, I've had these periods of intensity in the past, and I feel after time, maybe you kind of feel stuck. Like I've been doing my practice every day for a while. I don't feel like I'm making any progress. So can you just these questions are big and you can take them in any direction you want. But the problem of plateauing in practice, if you've struggled with that and how to kind of get out of it.
Yeah, good place to start. It brings me to some of the fundamentals that one has to become clear upon wherever you are on the spiritual path, and when you want to start is to really first get clear about what is it actually that we want to achieve with meditation. What is the purpose? Why am I doing this? Is it maybe just why did I get into this in the first place? Is it for stress reduction? Did I hear about it from some cool person and I just tried it? But when we really look into the deeper aspects, it quickly becomes clear that there's a real goal here with meditation that we have. And I like the term to say meditation facilitates seeing clearly. And by seeing clearly, it really is not just with the visual aspect, but in the sense that we have 6 senses basically. They put also the sense of thinking as the 6th sense in the Buddhist tradition. And seeing clearly means seeing all those aspects of reality very clearly. And so when you feel you have started with meditation and you ask, okay, what could be this next step for me? What direction should I go into? To remember that the goal is to see reality clearly. That's one very important first insight, actually, because then it becomes possible to say, I can actually let go of the idea that I am stuck, that I am at a certain point in my practice, and that I'm a certain type of meditator, or I have this certain history of meditation. Because when you see clearly, you will recognize that any thought about the past is just that. It appears as something in the mind. It is maybe a picture that flashes in front of your inner eye, or maybe it's a verbal thought that runs through your head. But actually really seeing clearly just acknowledges in the moment when it appears that, oh, this is a thought. And one aspect of all experience is that it's impermanent. And so recognizing that, okay, everything I ever have is impermanent sensations arising in the present, that's one very, very important insight one has along the way of meditation. And it's possible through recognizing that actually everything that I ever believed was no more than a thought. And then actually the work can begin, and you can label all of these different types of sensory inputs in your mind while you meditate. So just as for the beginner, it's the same practice as when you are beginner as when you are advanced. You sit there, and usually it's at first advised to do this in a quiet place, so there are not a lot of distractions coming from the outside. And then you label all of your experience so that you, first of all, learn what is experience made of. Yeah, the one last point I want to say about this feeling of being stuck is to recognize that there is no one being stuck, that this experience, whenever in meditation or outside of it, is flowing on. It is constantly, several times a second, you have some sensory impression, and the reality of being stuck somewhere or not being enlightened or being somewhere on the path, that's all conceptual. It's inside the content of a thought. And with meditation, we try to go beyond the content.
Yeah, very well said. And so to kind of summarize that idea is like I'm conceptualizing myself as stuck. And that is by that very nature of me talking about myself as being on a plateau or stuck or not making progress is indicative of the fact that I'm stuck in my conceptual mind. And there is this experiential shift that can happen once you build up some experience with meditation where, you know, especially I think it helps when we'll talk about momentum in a second, but where you're in a state of conceptualizing, whether that's good, neutral, or bad, you're thinking about something. And so just for example, I'm thinking in my house, walking around, thinking about how my meditation practice has stalled out, how I don't feel like I'm making progress, basically talking to myself in my head about my practice. And if you can catch yourself doing that, if you can catch yourself in the moment of, okay, oh, there I am, I'm lost in thought, thinking about, you know, what I'm doing, thinking about the past or the future me in relation to my practice, and just to be able to drop that even just for 2 to 3 seconds at a time and just fall back into an experiential present, meaning you're not talking to yourself or conceptualizing or having mental images about what you're doing or what you will be doing or what you have done, but you fall into the experiencing of the present moment in itself, which is sensations in the body. Maybe the breeze through my window is touching my face, making the right side of my face a little cooler than the left side of my face. You know, maybe my palms are a little sweaty, or I have an interesting sensation in my knee. And the moment you fall into that experiential mode, the problem that you thought you had 2 seconds ago isn't present, at least for that time. Now you can fall right back into thinking and conceptualizing, but at least in that moment, you've seen through the illusion that you were stuck at all. Is that right?
I couldn't have said it better. Yes, that's completely right. And that reminded me that there was the second part to your initial question, which is that of momentum. And what you just described is nothing difficult. Everyone can do that. And you can actually, for a moment, just recognize the actual quality of your experience. But then usually we have the opposite momentum, which is to quickly, after a few acknowledged moments, to go back into the content of our stories, of our concepts. And that's what makes it so hard to wake up, which is, you can compare it to like a journey with a bicycle up a hill, like a very high and very long hill. And one moment of recognizing reality as it is like one pedal stroke. And when you just do that for like 1 hour a day, or however long you decide to practice dedicated meditation in a day, that's just like one little, it's just like cycling up the hill for 1 hour, but the hill is much, much larger. And so when you stop your practice and you go back to the conceptual mind for the other, however many hours there are in the day to be awake, you roll back down that hill to the very beginning, and next day it's kind of like almost starting new again. And that's really what I have found in my personal experience gave me the most successes. I didn't start out with this idea in my mind that meditation was something that you practice on the cushion. Somehow I got into it with this very strong focus of mindfulness in all activities, in everyday life. And even though for the beginner that's a really difficult practice, because concepts are so ubiquitous, we use them all the time and we get lost in them very easily and quickly. When you keep at it and you apply some real effort to it, and you really know that you want to practice this, it's very, very powerful, and you can make a lot of progress in a very comparatively very short time if you dedicate all experience under the right attitude to this practice. And so that's what I recommended to you in the email, to say, okay, you recognize that you have been practicing in a certain way for a long time, and there is not much is changing. You don't have the feeling that this practice is really taking you to another way of seeing reality. Then, yeah, it could be possible that a time of very dedicated practice, which is usually in these traditions called retreats, very helpful, where you say, okay, I see I have this very mental work maybe, and I'm lost in concept all day, and I really recognize that it's difficult for me to keep this mindful mindset during the day. Then I go to a retreat for maybe 10 days or a week or 2 weeks and really dedicate basically all waking hours to this practice, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. Vipassana style retreats are meant to be a continuous stream of mindfulness, of recognizing what reality is. And so, yeah, that's how you can use and basically need momentum to really get certain insights from meditation.
I think that's incredibly important, and these are just analogies, but I've heard another analogy that kind of sticks in my mind of like, if you take like imagine trying to start a fire by rubbing two sticks together, right? You have to go hard, and then all of a sudden you start seeing a little smoke, and you keep going, and maybe a spark flies out, and you get the fire going. But the moment you stop turning the sticks, right, all the momentum that you've built up dissipates almost immediately. And so, you have to start all over, more or less. And in some sense, that might be kind of overly rigid in the sense that I think, like, even if you would dedicate a chunk of time every day, like on the cushion, to meditating, I think there's a certain underlying momentum that is kept up day by day, as opposed to moment by moment, where if you're going on retreat or trying to be there all the time. But it's not like, I meditated for an hour in the morning on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday when I wake up to meditate for an hour, I'm completely starting over in some sense. And there's the idea of the beginner's mind or whatever, but in the sense, like, no, I can actually kind of, if I keep up a practice, even if it's just a period of a day, it's easier. It becomes easier over time for me to fall into the meditative sort of mindset. And actually, I find myself falling into it naturally when I'm going about my daily life. So if I, spend let's say 30 minutes on the cushion that morning, I'm much more likely at 5 p.m. when I'm at a red light to naturally fall into that inner quiet place, that kind of that meditative spaciousness within. It happens almost automatically and much more easier than if I'm not keeping up a practice at all. And I notice, like, just in general, when I'm not keeping up a daily practice of any sort, my mind in general becomes much sloppier, much more susceptible to distraction, much more likely to look for distraction instead of peace and silence inwardly. So in that sense, momentum can operate at that level as well. Does that ring true to you?
Yes, absolutely. And definitely daily practice, if one is able to only, let's say, meditate really 1 hour a day, and then not has the time or not the possibility to really engage in mindfulness the other days of the other hours of the day, then really what you just said is very true. The practice can certainly keep you at the level that you're at. It may be slow progress, but it's also very beneficial in the sense that whatever level of insight you have gained, you can maintain that. Because on the other hand, as you just said, if you have periods when you don't meditate, these moments of mindfulness become very rare. And even your ability to access a certain level of presence and mindfulness in stressful situations, when it's really counting, drops dramatically if you don't have a meditative practice. And so there are a lot of benefits to a dedicated practice in the day. But really, it is not only something that you decide to do, what you just said, to remember to be mindful during the day. It is also already a fruit of the path. It is something that you will recognize. It's not something you decide to do. Every moment of mindfulness appears on its own, just as any other sensation. So it's difficult to say, I did this, I am mindful now. Of course, when you first start out, and this is the paradox, you have to engage the self. You have to know why you are excited about this. Why do you want this? It's very important to be clear of one's goals with meditation as well. Do I want this more than I would say mostly anything else? And if that's not a firm thing in your mind yet, then sooner or later this can also cause some slipping back or some stalling on the path and with the practice, because it will become difficult. It's not always easy, and when these difficulties come, they test how committed you are. So that's something not to forget.
Absolutely. You said earlier about labeling experiences, and maybe just touch on that kind of quickly. Are you specifically talking about the actual practice of noting in meditation, or are you meaning something a little less explicit than that? What do you mean by labeling the experiences when you're in meditation and you're watching sensations or whatever thoughts, feelings come up and fall away? What exactly do you mean by labeling experiences?
Yes, I think it's talked about with different words. So some people say noting, some labeling. Noticing is a little bit different, but labeling or noting is the practice of really becoming so clear with your experience that you can say, okay, this very short impermanent sensation that just arose is a certain thing. I say, for example, in meditation, you sit down and you watch your breath. Maybe you observe the sensations of your stomach rising and falling, and so you feel this sensation of your stomach rising, and with a mental thought, you just say the word rising. So you really concretely become aware that this, what you just experienced, was a momentary sensation of the stomach rising. And why we do that is to keep the mind engaged and focused on the practice. There is also the benefit of creating clarity, because with more subtlety, you will recognize that actually experience is made up of very, very short, very rapid experiences that make up the illusion of being a separate self, of the world, the 10,000 things out there, and the self, which is nothing more than just very rapid sensations arising and passing away. And as long as we cannot see these different aspects of experience clearly, it's difficult to untangle that and really let the mind grasp on a very direct experiential level what it means to see clearly. Because that's not something, and that's one other important factor I want to mention about meditation and the attitude in general, is to recognize the difference between the conceptual knowledge in spirituality, which is basically what we are talking about now, and to go beyond that, the willingness to go beyond that. Usually for people, it starts out with a lot of research and a lot of reading and trying to conceptualize this and trying to get it. And that's an important first stage that most people are on. But then really it comes down to practice, and that's where labeling comes in. You say, okay, I have recognized that I cannot understand this with the mind. I cannot transcend the mind through more understanding. And you then see that every situation you experience, whether that's on the cushion, or you're walking in the park, or you're listening to someone, or you're listening to the birds, or you feel the air on your skin, every moment is a moment you can recognize as such. And sooner or later, the mind will realize some very important aspects about reality, about what experience is made up of. And these important aspects are impermanence, suffering, and no self. So again, we are on the conceptual level, so it's easy for the mind to say, okay, I'm trying to look for impermanence or suffering or no self, which is not the way to go about this. In practice, you just do the practice and the insight will be the result. You will realize that experience has these three qualities. So that's what it means to go beyond the mind and beyond the concept, to leave them aside and continuously just observe thought as thought, feeling as feeling, seeing as seeing, hearing as hearing, and smelling as smelling. So just all the senses for what they are.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And just to kind of, double down on the idea of labeling experiences or of noting, you used a wonderful example of the arising of the abdomen when you're breathing. But it can you're just sitting there, you're sitting quietly. These are soft mental notes. So there's just nothing that you're saying out loud or whatever. But yeah, you're basically just telling yourself what you're feeling moment by moment, like thinking, sense. And these can be as, maybe when you're starting, you just have like a handful of categories, like thinking, feeling, this or that. And then maybe as the practice develops, you can get more nuanced with it, like, oh, this is memory, or this is thinking about the future, or whatever. But ultimately, noting itself can be dropped as well. And then you kind of come into a open awareness, if you will. Do you have anything to say about that transition from a more, focusing awareness on the ephemera of sensation and thoughts, etc., versus the dropping back into just sort of open awareness and the experiential difference there? I know it's a subtle question, but...
Yes, we can talk about this, and that's where the conceptual difference between noting and noticing comes in, which is this happens especially on longer retreats or with more continuous mindfulness, also in the daily experience. The mind drops into a state where it's so mindful that the sensations come at you so rapidly that there is no more space for really labeling the experience. It's like sound, sight, taste, touch, everything is meshed so quickly together that like it happens several times a second that you actually clearly perceive the experience, but the mind cannot quickly come in and say, this is such and such a feeling. And that's when you don't have to, you can still at a rather moderate pace of once a second, you can apply a label, you can continue to do that. And some people even advise that, but you can turn to noticing, which is then just quietly note to yourself, okay, I experienced this sensation consciously. So you don't say the full word in your mind, but you maybe just make a small mental note that's not a real word, but it's just recognizing that you have experienced this mindfully. And then even that, as you said, can drop away and you can merge with the flow of experience. But that is also, again, something that comes as a result of the practice. It's not, and that's why I also don't teach this to beginners. It's difficult to say when you are at the point that this shift happens, and when you have knowledge of this, it's rather easy to say, oh, I feel kind of advanced, I should drop the labeling and go maybe to noticing, or even drop that. But it's not like something that you decide to do. It's like the practice is developing with time through these stages automatically. So there is not really someone who can decide when it's time to do that or not. And actually, it's better if you are doubting whether you should still label or you should drop it, is to say, I can stay with labeling. That's more safe, because the labeling is yet just another sensation. Actually, it's arising, it's just a thought. So, but what this thought is doing, it's interrupting continuously the habitual tendency to get sucked into stories. So when you are outside and walking and you are kind of feeling fed up with this labeling, you say seeing, or walking, feeling this and that, and you have these labels in the mind, that's easy for the mind to become lazy and say, I want to switch to just recognizing everything as it is and not do this labeling. But the tendency then is to, after maybe a few minutes, to you get stuck again in a story and you go back to thoughts. So staying with labeling as long as possible and maybe even all throughout is definitely the safer bet.
Very helpful. Very interesting. Yeah, I like that a lot. And, just really this last thing on this point, because it is a little bit sort of advanced and might be over the head of beginners, of this idea of like through noting, you start to realize that a sensation that you took to, perhaps be a singular thing actually is made up of infinite micro moments and micro sensations. So just for example, the breath, if you were just to sit here, a normal person, focus on like, what is the sensation of the breath? Well, I feel like on the inhale, I feel like my abdomen expanding, and then there's a pause, and then on the exhale, there's a contraction, and then, you repeat. But, through noting and through meditation practice in general, you start to realize what you took to be three things, arising, pausing, contracting, actually is made up of functionally an infinite amount of micro sensations and moments in that thing that you called, the pause or the arising or the contraction. Your mind starts to be able to see with increasing clarity how that thing is actually made up of infinite micro moments in between, and that can sometimes give way to a sensation of disintegration and permanence, or the seeing through in a moment of clarity, the lack of a substantial self at the center of all of this. And so I think that is worth just knowing and being aware of. But I really liked what you said too about practicing, and the way you're kind of framing it is very much resonant with my experience, where the practice, you start as the beginner doing the practice, but very soon, if you're committed to it, you start realizing actually the practice is working through you. You are actually being worked. It's not you working the practice, if you will. And I found that to be a very interesting and actually quite fascinating experience, to start to realize like, I took this to be a thing that I was doing, but it's very clear that this thing is operating within me, and I'm a sort of a superfluous thing. It's happening without my direction and my control, and that in and of itself can be quite the revelation.
Yeah, what you just mentioned is probably one of the most important steps along, if we can map out this process at all. But some people say don't do that and say it's difficult. But if we can, then what you just mentioned is one of the very important steps along the way, and phases that you go through, which is called the stream entry, or in other traditions, the rising and passing. It is the moment when one has intuitions about this earlier, before it happens, but when it's really, really deeply clear to you that this process is kind of driving itself, and you couldn't ever do this process of awakening, then you have passed this point of no return, basically. It is clear that awakening is going to happen. And whether that's in this lifetime or in what they call in Buddhist, in rebirth, that is up to debate. So it's not guaranteed that this idea of you, this human being now, can wake up after this point, but it's very, very likely. And this insight is so profound because there is a lot of, actually, it's not a very early insight, it's quite an advanced insight, and most people have to put in a lot of work to get to that stage, but it makes clear one of the three characteristics that I mentioned earlier, which is no self. This comes with the insight of the one I thought to do the practice that was connected to these feelings of struggle, of striving, of doing stuff, of engaging focus and effort, that this is really just part of the flow of experience. That is part of the sensations arising. That is very, very significant. And it already, when it's complete and genuine, it rewires how you perceive reality.
Yeah, and I kind of think of stream entry, to use more conceptual analogies, is like, passing the event horizon of a black hole or something. At that point, and you're sort of locked in. Now you are being taken for a trip, if you will, and there's no more even illusion that you're the one in control. So the idea of stream entry, and just it's sort of intuitive, like you're just dipping yourself into a stream and being carried away by the current, and that image is pretty powerful. But again, that's a pretty high level accomplishment, if you will, in the practice. And I'm certainly not claiming that I've been that far. I'm just saying that I have had the inklings, the sort of, the little revelations, the micro revelations of no self in this stuff. But I don't necessarily, whatever, it's not worth it to talk about where I think I am. But even if I'm not there, I can still, before reaching there, kind of see how the practice itself is working through me, and that there is no me in control of the process, even though you almost have to have that illusion to start the entire thing. You almost have to have the illusion that I'm going to start a meditation practice because it's what I want to do, and I'm going to sit down for this amount of time, and I'm going to do this. And so there's that paradox of like the feeling that you're in control and that you can apply effort and will towards a project and accomplish it is an illusion ultimately that you will see through on the path, but it's almost necessary for the path, for you to begin down the path in the first place. And then you're disabused of that notion over time. And I always thought that was a fascinating, paradox, if you will, in this entire spiritual realm, but specifically within Buddhism.
Exactly. You could go maybe even further and say, that's part of the definition of the process of waking up, because why can you wake up? It's because you have been asleep before. So it's clear that there was illusion before. But on this path, it is just a continuous work with actual reality. That's why it's when you mention something like, okay, these teachings, they belong to Buddhism and they are like part of this larger framework that they established of how to wake up. That's true on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's just tools to investigate reality. It's a way of seeing clearly what is arising every moment. And what the Buddha discovered of how to do this, and how people after him have refined the traditions, which have led to different traditions within Buddhism. It's a huge field. They have all recognized this, that actually there is nothing inherently to be believed in Buddhism. They don't tell you anything, actually. They all what they tell you is based on the notion that, yes, we also have here these tools that when you use them, you can discover these things on your own. So it always comes, as I said in the beginning, with the warning of all conceptual knowledge can be interesting, and we need it in order to communicate with another about this. But for the practice, none of that actually applies. You cannot sit there in meditation and actually reflect upon experiencing. I mean, that is going to happen nonetheless. It's going to happen that you want to explain your experience to yourself, but that has to happen under the umbrella of being mindful of that. So again, as recognizing thought as thought, concept as concept. Because as long as you are in thoughts and in the content, no matter whether those thoughts are genuinely good in their content or bad, that difference actually is minor in meditation practice and has no real implication. So thinking good thoughts can actually be the larger trap, because it's easy to recognize bad thoughts that one actually doesn't want to think in meditation and recognize those, but then the real good ones, it's harder to let go of those.
Totally. Yeah, and I really love your overall point about Buddhism. Let's just take that is a toolbox. You don't want to fetishize it. There's the idea of like Buddhism is a raft you use to cross the river. When you're on the other side, you let go of the raft. You don't keep carrying it, and to keep carrying it is the metaphor for fetishizing the tradition, or treating it as a purely intellectual, philosophical system, amongst others, to reduce Buddhism to its merely conceptual, argumentative, claim-making side, metaphysics, arguing metaphysics from a Buddhist perspective. It can be fun, and it can be useful, like philosophy in general is fun to debate and talk about and think about and research, but ultimately the rubber hits the road when you let go of that and actually do the practice itself. And when you're in the midst of the practice, there is no room for thinking about the philosophy of Buddhism or arguing Buddhism against a competing system or whatever it might be. So I think that toolbox or that raft metaphor is very helpful along the journey. So as you can always kind of temper your love and appreciation of this tradition with that realization that you don't want to turn it into an identity. You don't want to basically do spiritual materialism and turn your spiritual path into a garment that the ego dresses itself in.
Yeah, you said that perfectly. And one of the tools, you could say, in Buddhism that's definitely important for the advanced stages, which comes back to your initial question about feeling stuck, is that it is easy at a certain level of development to reach very pleasant states in meditation, to the point where like you are really genuinely looking forward to your hour of meditation and you like to go into that. But that is actually a very sneaky trap that I think many people can fall into and sadly get stuck there for decades, because these pleasant traps, they feel so good. But what is actually happening there is a lack of clarity. There is a lack of seeing clearly the sensations arising in the moment. And you could sit in meditation with pleasant sensations arising for years, but when you never clearly perceive them and label them, actually, going back to the initial practice of saying, okay, I am feeling this pleasantness, I'm clearly seeing it, I'm not letting it slip under the radar, I'm going to ruthlessly observe every sensation that comes flying at me. Only through that can you actually go beyond this attachment to pleasantness.
Yeah, I think that is so helpful. You know, like as you said earlier, yeah, when you're in Buddhist, you're doing these meditation practices, yeah, you notice the intense negative emotions, and it's quite easy you want to fall into a state where those feelings no longer have a grip over you, and so the practice can really get some traction in that regard. But the first moment you have a pleasant or even an ecstatic experience in or adjacent to your meditation practice, that same skepticism and that same willingness to look at it clearly disappears in favor of reveling in it and thinking, this is actually it. This experience is the thing I'm looking for in the practice, this experience of peace or of quietness or of calmness, where, in the actual Buddhist practice, you would just look at that as another fleeting, temporary experience that comes and goes, and not to cling to the good, just like you're willing to not cling to the bad. And that's very important. And it actually is a great transition to this next question, because you just talked about how you can have these really amazing experiences, and especially often in the beginning, you can have some very enjoyable experiences. And that was my experience as a late teen, early 20-something when I first started the practice. I remember just having ecstatic moments and kind of deluding myself that these experiences were the path cashing out for me already. And so I had like, I would be like driving around and just like weeping in joy at a sunset. Or I remember at one point, 19 years old, telling my like stepdad in a grocery store, I discovered this meditation stuff. I've been doing it for like, a few months, and I've figured out life. Like, I don't think I'll ever be sad again. Like, now looking in retrospect, it was absolutely laughable how naive I was, but it was a very real, jolt of an ecstatic, positive feeling that I had in those early experiences, and I almost kind of thought, this is it. And little did I know I was just taking the first baby steps on a path that is by no means a simple upward slope to more happiness and peace, but is actually can be very challenging. And so this is the question I want to kind of bounce off you with that in mind, which is this idea of cycling. And that's probably not a word that a lot of people use, just a word I'm using right now. But I've felt in my relationship to my practice going in these big cycles where, I'll start the practice, I'll have these deepening spiritual experiences or whatever, just the benefits that accrue to you when you really do a meditation practice, feeling very, very good. And then eventually it'll hit a wall, not in the sense of a plateau, but in the sense of, oh, some negative things are coming up now. And so I've been through these cycles, a handful of times throughout my 10, 12 years of doing meditation practice, where there'll be a period of growth and deepening and real benefits accruing to me through the practice. And then at some point, some negative stuff will start coming up, some stuff that I wasn't dealing with. And there's, you can call it a dark night or whatever, but these prolonged periods of what I would call spiritual suffering or spiritual trials and tribulations, where I feel like I've taken a step back, or like something new is coming up, or why am I having a new wave of neuroticism, right? Like when I first started meditating, for example, one of the main benefits that accrued to me was a real sense of confidence, like almost like I was coming out of my insecure teenage years and I was very, very confident. And I was like, I don't think I'll ever be neurotic again. But then periods of neuroticism certainly have come since then, intensely. And it's almost been disorienting because I was like, I thought I had already gotten beyond this. And so what do you think is this? Am I just making this up? Am I imposing a pattern where none exists? Or is there something here to this idea of cycles as you engage in these practices over long periods of time?
Yes, what you just described, your experience is very common. I don't know if you could say that every meditator experiences this. Probably not. Some go straight all the way and do it in, like you could say, one cycle. But most people climb the ladder, so to speak, and then they fall back down a bit and have to get what they have thought to understood again on a deeper level maybe, and have to go through certain insights again and again, because it's not that you have to see certain things once and then your whole mode of operating switches over and is replaced by the one that's fitting reality more clearly. So it takes repetition, which we do in meditation all the time. You observe the breath, which is in itself a cycle, and you go back to the cushion over and over again every day. So it's a practice, and no matter where you conceptualize to be at the moment, which may be valid and could help you to find important pointers in your practice, but the ground is again to let go of those ideas, of those memories, and observe the rapid arising sensations in the moment, very, very arduously, over and over and over again. Because the mind comes back in and shows you very clearly that, oh, I'm still clinging to this experience. I'm still dependent upon content of experience. Whenever you have the memory of, oh, my last meditation session, they went so great. Now I expect this meditation session to go the same way, and then it's horrible, and you are struggling. Then what can come from that if you continue to practice well? And for the practice, it doesn't matter what content arises, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Then you can actually get the insight through these repeated cycles that you are not in control, because there is no one to be in control. And really, this insight has to sink in deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's why this path shows you that nothing is worth clinging to. Even the good fruits and the good experiences that come from the practice, or that you say are associated with the effort that you put in. So it's very natural, but the solution at every step is again to apply equanimity with the sensations that are arising. So whenever something is painful or pleasant, to recognize that as such, and if necessary, maybe something on a deeper, more subtle level arose for you, then put a new label on it. If you observe that something that's repeatedly arising, and it will go away after a certain time, if that's an unpleasant emotion, or even in daily life, a not conducive activity, or what they say in Buddhism, unwholesome activities, they will drop away with clear seeing. So it's natural and nothing to worry about, actually.
Okay.
So that would be my advice for you right there.
That's very helpful, and I really love this idea of repetition, of having to see something over and over and over and over again to really get it. And just to speak my audience's language for a second, when they're getting into, let's say, Marxist philosophy, you come across a term like historical materialism. You read the definition, the first 3 times you do it, you still have no clue. If I asked you after you just read the definition, can you in your own words explain this concept? You would have a very hard time doing it. Engaging with it over and over again, hearing this thinker talk about it, this thinker talk about it, this third thinker talk about it, and disagree with the first 2. It's through that process that you really start to deeply understand the thing. And that is exactly true in this practice as well. But the things that you're saying are things about how your own mind acts and your own behavioral and emotional momentum and patterns you're locked into operate. And just by virtue of seeing them clearly, the bonds that they have on you loosen and over time dissolve. It's not like you see a thing and then now you have to exert will and do something to get rid of it. It's like the spotlight of attention and awareness, clearly seeing a thing, is all it takes to make that, whatever it is, to loosen its grip on you and ultimately fall away from you.
Yeah, certainly. And one thing that came to my mind while you were speaking about this is when you have in conceptual terms, maybe you want to understand a concept, what you're actually doing is like you get pieces of information from different areas, and then you connect them, you listen to them, you integrate them, and it really deeply connects to the whole body of knowledge that's already within your mind. And so then it becomes a part of you when it's really kind of becoming this part of this larger mesh, and you can really know how it relates to all other aspects. And that's the same with, or not the same, but in a comparable way, it's similar with practice. The more you do it, the more you see that it is actually connected to every experience you have. It is what reality is made up of, finally. So there is no part of reality that you could say is not subject to these qualities that we are trying to unravel and become clear about.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question before we move on to the next topic is the idea of, it's talked about differently, but like the burning off of karma or whatever it may be, or these dark nights of the soul, or however you want to put it. My experience is that challenging things come up that before my practice or throughout the rest of my life, I've not properly dealt with. And so one example in my early meditation sort of experiences was I had a lot of anxiety around death. I was, scared of it, and at times it would break through and I would have panic attacks. I would just be like in the kitchen talking with my brother, and he would mention some casual remark about the fact that we're all going to die or something, and I would just go into a full-blown internal panic attack. And that was like my experience, especially in my early 20s. And at some point, especially through my practicing, I fell into what I now call a dark night. These words are kind of clunky, but it was just a prolonged period of 4 to 6 months where every single day of my life, I woke up and went to bed tortured and thinking and obsessing about death and the reality of it. And I remember trying to do exposure therapy to myself. So I'd look in the mirror and just you just have to face it. So I'd be like, you're going to die. Everyone you love is going to die. Accept it. And that didn't help. And I was just really lost. And I was very scared. I thought my brain was broken. I was like, I can't even go to get a pill for this because there's no pill that makes you not scared of your own mortality. And so it was a prolonged period of deep, deep suffering. But when I came out of it, my relationship to death has radically changed, and the fear of it diminished 98%. And even sitting now about 8 years after I had this experience, the grip that the fear of death had on me before I had that experience is completely gone. Even if I sit down and really focus on my own death, I cannot for the life of me conjure up fear and anxiety that used to come so naturally. And so this, I kind of conceptualize this as this is something that I was dealing with. I could have repressed it my entire life and had it nip at my heels and come up in these inopportune moments. But through my spiritual practices, I dislodged this thing. I had to face it. I had to look at it. I had to, as I say, have my face shoved in the shit of my own fear. And it was that process that was hard and difficult and scary and uncertain. But that was that ultimately freed me of that fear. And I connect that deeply to my spiritual practice before, during, and after that experience. Does any of that ring true to you, or is this more conceptualizing and making a story where none really exists?
What you just described is a beautiful example of what happens many times on the spiritual path, is when you work through a very deep aspect of your self-construct, which are in really deep-rooted frameworks and concepts, mental structures, you could even say, about ourselves. It's easy to say, yeah, what we do in meditation is letting go of those ideas about self. But actually the process, as you just described, can feel quite dramatic, because in the brain, and there are interesting theories about how this happens, and without going too deep into it, you can imagine that like a mental concept is actually an energy system. It is something that constantly needs to be fed some mental energy. And when it kind of, you could say, realizes that you are no longer giving it this energy, then the natural reaction, the quickest way to get new attention and energy is to provoke feelings of fear, because fear is so intense. It's such an it's not a energy that we like to look at. It's an emotion that it goes through the body. It's like kind of very, it's kind of like you don't want to put your attention really on it. You're trying to hide from it. And then when such a concept feels kind of threatened, such a self-concept, and thinking that you are going to die, that death is a real thing, that's part of your self-construct. So letting go of that it's going to rebel, and it's doing that by sending out these waves of fear, because then you are no longer looking there. You're no longer looking at the fear directly. That's kind of its protective mechanism. And the terminology dark night of the soul really hits it home, because it really feels like you are all wrapped up in that. That's your whole world. It's this pain, it's this whatever kind of reaction you are going through at the moment. And it doesn't really help to flee from that. And you did the right thing, even though maybe you didn't have the best tools at the time. But the thing is, or the way forward is to just face it head on. And in meditation, you would just apply more mindfulness to those. You would try not to ignore feelings of pain and suffering or anxiety or panic. Those would just be more objects of meditation. And hopefully, when they arise, you have already built up enough equanimity and clarity that you are going to power through that. And those are the times when your commitment to the practice is surely tested.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I don't think I've quite had anybody put it to me in terms like that, but it certainly makes a lot of sense, and I'm grateful for that. I didn't have any tools. I didn't even know what the phrase dark night of the soul was. I was very naive. I wasn't in a community. I didn't have any teachers. I mean, I live in Nebraska in the middle of the United States. I've never met, naturally in my personal life, somebody else interested in this stuff. So I really, went through it in a way that was incredibly scary. But if I had just one person reach out to me and say, hey, what you're going through is very tough. You will come out the other side and you'll come out better. Just hearing that once from somebody who'd gone through it would have alleviated a huge chunk of the suffering that I was going through. But it is what it is. And I had to go through that and learn that lesson in my own way. But certainly if anybody out there is on this path or is going to get on this path or any path like it and goes through experiences like that, knowing about that possibility ahead of time can do a lot to blunt the fear, because there's a lot of panic around my feeling that my brain was broken. And now I look back at it in retrospect and see that was a deeply needed, deeply healing process that I went through. And I'm so grateful that I went through it. But at the time I was scared shitless and nobody knew how to help me. And so, there's more talk of this in spiritual communities in the last few years. And I think that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the blessings of our times, is that this availability of good information has definitely increased. Yet there's also, it's coming with the curse of how do you find the right information, because there's so much out there, and to sort out the wheat from the chaff, that took me also a long time. And it's probably everyone, you stumble into this, and then you buy books and you listen to talks and seminars, and you have no way to distinguish what is genuine and real and from what is like maybe commercialized and maybe has actually different goals than true spiritual awakening. But there's no way really of going around this. It's as you said, it's sad that we don't have more of this embedded in our culture, that you could go to like a spiritual therapist, because these experiences, they happen naturally to many people, just that the terminology we use today to recognize those are usually different, and then the therapy may not be completely the best. But actually, when awakening can happen also without ever hearing about spirituality, it's maybe you get the hint of that this can happen to you if you are a person that pays a lot of attention to experience. Sometimes musicians, for example, they pay such close attention to the sense of hearing that they have kind of realizations and breakthroughs, but without the proper concept of what's happening to them, sometimes it can be difficult, and it's termed like something like how do we call it, burnout or whatever, some other sloppy definition that doesn't really help. But I think I'm hopeful that in the coming decades this will certainly move closer and to the center, maybe not to the center of society, but at least it's easier to access good quality information.
Yeah. And when something new comes into a culture, there's always going to be that process of various detours and dead ends, and the co-option by commercial forces, like the Amazon Zen booth is a thing in America now, where Amazon warehouses have a little 3-minute meditation booth you can go in to calm down, to increase your productivity, something that is nauseating to me. And there's also a whole world of narcissists presenting themselves as gurus and knowledgeable spiritual such and suches, and cults and everything like that. So it can definitely be hard to navigate, especially if you don't have anybody to help you, or if it's new in a cultural environment. And I think we're going through introducing this stuff to the West, and then all of the pathologies of the West, taking it in a million directions. But I think it's a necessary part of that coming into our culture, and ultimately, hopefully, having a deep and stable spot within it. But it's a process. And I really also appreciate what you said about attention. And you talked about musicians, sometimes just the hyper, awareness of the sound and losing yourself in the moment by moment construction of melody and music. And that can be an impetus to some sorts of spiritual awakening. I think is very interesting, and it goes beyond the Buddhist tradition. So in Sufism, for example, there's the whirling dervishes, and again, it's this spinning of the body, and then what you do with attention in that process. Or in the Christian tradition, in deep prayer, you become very concentrated on more or less a mantra in some cases, if you're repeating a prayer over and over again. And some people could have mystical or spiritual awakening moments just doing that, even if they weren't trying to cultivate it or weren't even aware that it was a possibility. So somebody that comes to mind is like an Eckhart Tolle. I don't know what your thoughts are on him, but he's somebody I came across early in my spiritual investigations. And my understanding of his story is precisely this, that he wasn't engaging in any spiritual practices, but was at such an abysmal pit of deep, profound, suicidal suffering that something broke within him. At least that's how he tells it. And so in that case, at least if you take him at his word, there is little to no conscious path taking, and it was just more or less by accident that he had a ruptural awakening event. Now, you certainly shouldn't just sit back and say, hopefully it comes for me. Like, I think people are interested in this. You have to put some effort, especially initially, into doing it. But those things do happen, and it's just worth mentioning that those possibilities are out there, I guess.
Yes, suffering is one of the probably most common things that put you on the path and make you discover spirituality. Because when something that unpleasant is overpowering every moment of your life, and there's no more coping mechanism that your mind can find to escape it, you very quickly realize some aspects about reality, and that is that you have no control. That like you didn't wish upon yourself the suffering, and yet it's happening. You don't even have the control to get out of it, maybe not even for a few moments, and it just continues. Then, in a certain bizarre way, it can make this work a lot easier, and it can definitely facilitate researching this stuff and finding alternative ways of escaping suffering, because that's really the ultimate goal, to realize it doesn't make sense for anything to avoid anything else. So when you realize deeply that there are only sensations arising, then with that comes the realization that there is nobody who could be hurt by certain negative sensations, certain kinds of pain. But yet, that's something people rarely discover when everything is going great and you have a certain sense of autonomy and you can kind of do things to keep you kind of relatively comfortable within your comfort zone. Then that's how most people live their lives. So suffering never gets so out of hand that the only escape is through, because you cannot escape anymore. Then all coping strategies fail, and then awakening out of the illusion of being someone who's suffering that becomes the only option.
Yeah, and there's plenty of stories like that in the world of spiritual awakening, where people have suffered just insane tragedies and just have been absolutely pinned down by it, and there's as you say, nowhere else to go but through. And certainly suffering has been the driving force in my experience with interest in Buddhism and meditation and all these things. But I have a very good friend who is just constituted in such a way where he has a high baseline mood, and he never really deviates from that. He's never suffered with anxiety or depression. He's incredibly confident, incredibly unique, incredibly successful, and he's tried meditation. He sat down a few times because of my interest in it and me kind of like, you should kind of check this out. He's very, very smart, so I was like, you should try this out. He sat down a few times like, I don't really see anything in it. And maybe if he kept doing it, he would. But there, like you said, there isn't a need. He never feels as if he's suffering. And, he's very confident and comfortable in his own skin, and all outward appearances, he's doing quite well. And so there's really no impetus for him to dedicate a life to going inward and trying to eradicate suffering. Whereas, I had the exact opposite experiences in my life, maybe genetically or whatever it is. I don't have a high baseline. I have peaks and valleys that I go through constantly. So that suffering has certainly pushed me in this direction. But people have different experiences for sure.
Yeah, and certainly what you said there about your friend, that people with high intellect often struggle with this, is, with the simplicity of this technique, is the point is not to be really conceptualizing about it. And when someone comes to these very simple practices, oftentimes their mind has been through like school and university. You train this ability to conceptualize to such a refined degree that it's a very powerful tool, and you are used to use this tool to your benefit quite often at work and outside of it. So with very intelligent people, I find also that they have harder times not to engage this conceptual mind. It's their tool. It's their tool for success. It's how they get everything out of life that they need, the success, the money, the whatever people think about them is based all on this tool of knowing how to conceptualize very accurately to a high degree many things. But in this work, it fails. And so, paradoxically, and maybe it's not even bad. I mean, there's nothing bad. You don't have to wake up. You don't have to do this work at all. In the ultimate sense, you don't even have a choice. Yeah. Either you wake up or you don't. But yeah, that's why most people don't wake up. It's too comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to, we're already pretty deep in here. I want to be respectful of your time. I want to talk about kind of rapid fire, the importance of four things on a spiritual path. This is the importance of a teacher, the importance of a spiritual community, the importance of retreats, and then the possible importance of a therapy or something, that addresses some issues outside of the practice itself. So kind of let's take these one by one and just give me your, off the top of your head thoughts about how important these things are for somebody just starting out or deeper in a path. For example, I myself have been doing this stuff mostly in a lone wolf style. At first out of necessity, but then for whatever reason, I just haven't made the jump to joining a community or really seeking out a teacher, even though at times I felt like those things were quite needed or at least could be helpful. And I guess you could find teachers in this modern world in different ways. You can go online and I could read books from, spiritual teachers all around the world and hear podcast talks and Dharma talks. And so I have an access to teachers that people before the internet never even had that. And so certainly it might stand in to an extent. But I'm just wondering how important you think these things are. And let's start with teachers. Do you think they're essential or do you have one? How do you think of their relevance?
Yeah, in that regard, I was similar to you for many years. I didn't have one, and I searched the jungle of information myself and did all kinds of practices and combined them all, which definitely also helped me and got me quite a bit of insight. But really, when I decided to go with a teacher, in my personal experience, and that's also what they say in the tradition, things moved ahead a lot quicker and got easier as well, because maybe it's first necessary to do quite a bit of research on your own before you can decide on a teacher which sounds or speaks to you, which you are resonating with, and which you can really say to yourself, okay, I'm going to trust this person on everything he says regarding practice. I'm going to trust that what he is recognizing in me, what he is saying to be the right thing for me, I'm going to trust that. Then definitely that's the right thing for you to do. And that's also the thing I would apply if I'm looking for teachers. Can I really genuinely provoke that feeling within me, that I'm willing to trust him? Then it's a good time and it's a good fit with that teacher. Because without that, a teacher is no more than any other kind of information to you. But with the commitment, then you gain the benefit of not getting sidetracked so easily anymore. Even though there are many different styles of meditation out there, which can all be useful and helpful and apply at certain times, when you commit to one thing, there's the benefit of what we also said earlier, momentum. The mind has to first learn the practice and then really apply the effort to it. And when you switch out the practices every couple of weeks or months, probably the momentum you've built up was not that great, and it's easy to become frustrated because you're not yet seeing the results with it. So the teacher gives you the benefit of keeping you accountable and stay with that practice. So yeah, I definitely, to keep a short answer, if you feel you are committed to this, get a teacher.
Now, is it better even in the digital, epoch to find a teacher that you can actually be in person with, or is it okay to just find somebody that is remote, doesn't live near you, but with all the technology today, you can still have access to? Do you have any? Is it just a person by person preference thing or options thing, or is there a clear winner as far as what's preferable there?
You can definitely choose any teacher that you can have a conversation with. So whether that's in person or digitally over the phone, in my opinion, makes no difference.
Okay.
So there are some ideas out there that you are like going to be awakened in the presence of some special teacher just by you being in the same room with them. I find it funny and cannot really speak to the validity of that, but I would doubt it. And so, you can choose any teacher basically nowadays around the world. And when you have the ability to speak with them on a regular basis, once a week or every 2 weeks, that does the job perfectly fine.
Cool. Okay, the next one is Sangha, or a spiritual community. How important is that? Because there's actually a movement locally here, not a movement, but an organization here locally that doesn't have a teacher. There's no like prescribed practice or no person that gives necessarily Dharma talks, but it's just a community of about like 25 people at various parts of the path that just come together and they meditate together and they talk together. But, it's all as a community of equals with no teacher. And, that's interesting. And there's obviously communities with a teacher at its head. But in general, just the idea of a spiritual community, how important is that?
That differs from individual to individual. Generally, it is a great support. So when you have access to that and you want to make use of that, that's definitely a plus. Because it's easy to get sidetracked, and the more people you have in your social circle that you can talk to about this and your experiences and get their input and just see, other people are doing this as well, and there are maybe people slightly ahead of me and they report these and such changes, and then it makes this whole journey much more relatable and much more realistic to you, and it seems not such a strange and such a out there conceptual thing. And having people to talk to about these things, I think, is very important. So how you do that, if that needs to be like a committed social gathering once a week and only talk about one style of Buddhism, for example, I don't think that's necessary, but having a few close friends that you can talk to about what you are going through in regard to this, I would say you don't want to go without that. So looking online, maybe somewhere they don't have to live near you, just so that you have someone in a similar position who can really relate. That's really, really, really helpful.
Awesome. And the next one is retreats, and this is of particular importance because it's something you and I have talked about. I did a very small one-day sort of retreat on my birthday this year, and that was interesting. But, I have multiple young children, constantly busy. I mean, one of my kids is 7 months old, so it is a constant situation of me tending to my kids. And, for me or my wife to leave the house, it has to be planned, like, okay, you'll watch the kids while I go do this, etc. And so and a lot of people are in that position where it's very hard, if not impossible, to go on a 2-week or a month-long retreat. But, there are smaller retreats. But just in general, how important are retreats on the spiritual practice, specifically within Buddhism?
Yeah, that to that point, I can come back to what I mentioned, I think, towards the beginning, is retreats are basically just all-day mindfulness. They give you the container in which you can really focus on practice all day long. So retreats usually are not set up in a way that you do sitting style meditation for 14 hours or something like this. So it's broken up into individual times where you walk, where you eat mindfully, where you sit, of course. So in a certain sense, there's nothing special about retreats. It is just a container that makes it very easy to keep up that mindfulness continuously. So whenever you find yourself in a situation where retreats are not an option, what you could do is really ramp up that mindfulness in activity where conceptual thinking is not that important. And it's surprising that you can discover that actually most of the time you need very little conceptualizing. Many things you have learned and they have become so automatic in your day that you can do them while being completely mindful. That even includes talking to people, cooking, of course, things like doing work around the house, running the errands. So that's a really good option, and to kind of close this gap between daily life and retreat in one's mind and the idea, that's a really good idea, because it doesn't, because it can hold you back if you think like, oh, only when I'm able to do this 1 week of a retreat, that will be time worth practicing. No, you can practice everywhere, and you can even gain a lot of benefit of saying, okay, I have my daily practice, but then I can get Sundays free, and I really maybe once a month I say, okay, this whole day I dedicate to meditation, and you will be surprised that these 10 or 12 hours or maybe more that you can dedicate to practice, they are more powerful than probably a couple of months of just 1 hour a day, for example. So these options as well, but of course, going to a retreat, to a dedicated retreat, that would be the ideal scenario, because distractions are reduced and it's much easier to practice.
Yeah, the entire environment is set up to be conducive to long-term consistent practice, and in a lot of those retreats you'll have the benefit of a teacher and the interview with them. So as you're practicing and deepening, you can also have these moments where you go in and can speak to the teacher, ask questions, or whatever that may be, which can also be very helpful. But I really like your point that you can't have it as this idea of like, okay, I will take this stuff seriously when I'll eventually in the future have the time to go out and do a retreat, because that's just putting things off, and that's living in the the future oriented mindset and conceptualization, and just being at home even with kids. You're right. If you truly dedicated it, you could do an entire day where you just said, no matter what comes up, I'm gonna have to change diapers and make bottles and clean up after the kids and change the litter box. I can do all of that while being mindful and noting the sensations arising and in practicing. There's nothing, this formal split between sitting on the cushion and the rest of your life. It might be helpful at the very beginning, but very quickly, and the sooner the better, to do away with that division, because ultimately it's superfluous. This is meant to permeate your daily life. And in the beginning, like, I had this idea that it needed to be super quiet. I needed, everybody out of the house, and only then could I go into my room and sit down and have a really good meditation practice. But as it's developed, it's like I could be in the middle of a construction site. I could be at the landing strip of, LaGuardia Airport. And if your mindfulness and the momentum behind it is in the right place, there's nothing inherently non-conducive about even the most intense daily cacophonous experiences. And so I think that's really important too, and to let that boundary dissolve as quickly as you can between formal practice and the rest of your life. I think the better.
Yeah, I loved how you put that. That's beautiful. I can only agree. Like, sometimes you can even go out into very busy places, and it can be a very exhilarating experience actually to look, okay, can I catch every little sensation that's coming at me here, because there's so much going on and so rapidly flying at you, and you're just like you are driving a Formula 1 car, and you have to be on the spot every second not to miss one sensation. And so actually with a certain level of mindfulness, there's nothing that needs to be excluded from the practice.
All right, last one of this little section is therapy, or forms of help outside of spiritual practice. Sometimes people with deep, let's say, childhood abusive trauma, for example, obviously lots of suffering, pushed into spiritual communities, sometimes with the idea that by merely engaging in these spiritual practices, I will be able to work through and dissolve my trauma. But I've heard other people, especially some very well-practiced and accomplished meditators, say there can easily be a place outside of practice for going and going to therapy and dealing with some other stuff. And I know there's Ken Wilber out there who talks about growing up, cleaning up, and waking up. So waking up is obviously the meditative experience of waking up from the illusion of separateness. Growing up has the ethical component to it, but cleaning up is like this, outside of practice, going to therapy, trying to deal with the shit you went through as a kid, and that can be helpful. And sometimes it's harmful to think that simply by engaging in these spiritual practices, I will dissolve or do away with, trauma that I suffered as a child or whatever it may be. And I'm not taking a position on this. I'm just sort of laying out the different positions. What is your take on the importance or relevance of stuff like therapy in addition to a practice?
Yeah, all of these three areas are of great importance, and in the vast Buddhist literature you will find content on all of them. And these three terms, I would put them in the order of waking up, cleaning up, and growing up. Which is, if you decide you want to become, let's use this term, the best version of yourself, then it is definitely of great help to first get to know the basics, like what is this reality really like. So put all your eggs in the basket of waking up first. So because in a sense, you can then realize that many of the problems that you would put in the category of cleaning up, like your traumas and bad behaviors, they will clear up. Maybe not all of them, but many of them will clear up through seeing clearly what reality is. So first, waking up is just, you cannot really be sane without it. So doing therapy and all of that, that's fine. It can help, but only to a very limited degree. And the further you are into waking up, you will also see all of those limitations and why they are there. So don't forget to be ethical along the way, because yes, there are situations during your path where you are dealing with so much of your own stuff that it's sometimes the ego comes back so hard, and you feel like you have to protect certain things, and you act weirdly because you are going through this spiritual crisis. But to have a baseline level of how to behave morally and ethically should be in place. But if you think you have that, then it's definitely completely safe to go all out on waking up first, and then continue afterwards with cleaning up, and then growing into whichever direction life takes you then.
Nice. Yeah, that's very interesting, and I largely agree for sure. And in my experience, I definitely, as a normal human being, had moral and ethical ideas and ostensible commitments before I got into this practice. But I have noticed that just by virtue of doing the practice and sticking with it over many years, that the ethical behavior happens automatically. It's like, when I'm presented with a moral situation, there's no, ego trying to finagle some way for me to come out on top of this situation, even if that means stepping over somebody or whatever. That just kind of goes away, and it's so clearly obvious in most cases. Obviously, there's some very complicated moral situations, but in most daily situations, the right choice is increasingly obvious and is automatically chosen. more or less. That's how I feel it. So, definitely having good ethics when you come into it is good. And just being an ethical person, regardless of whether or not you're engaged in spirituality, is obviously a positive trait. But I've known that through practice itself, my ethics have become much more consistent, much deeper, and just sort of automatic, as opposed to something where I have to debate or think about heavily. So that's just my experience. But
yeah, certainly. That's some people even say when you're fully enlightened, you're incapable of unethical action. So there is certainly something to that, because you see so clearly and you recognize suffering so clearly for what it is that, and on top of that, there is no self like stepping in that needs to be defended. Yeah, not important anymore to gain something out of the individual sensations.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Just to wrap this up, we should I'll definitely have you back on, because there's more things I wanted to talk about, like self-inquiry, dual versus non-dual approaches, the role of love, spiritual materialism and bypassing. But I think those are going to have to wait for our next conversation, which we'll definitely have. But as a way to end this conversation, assuming there are, people listening out here who are curious about what we're talking about, maybe it's striking a chord. I mean, my experience when I, first got into spirituality was I was introduced to these ideas, and immediately something deep within me was like fascinated and attracted to it, even though I had very little understanding of what it even was I was getting interested in. And so I can only imagine that there's going to be at least a few people out there that listen to episodes like this, and something within them is being like triggered, is being pulled in this direction. And if you are experiencing that as a listener, I would definitely urge you to, follow up on that feeling and try to pursue and experiment with these things. But for the last little segment here, I just kind of want to give some tips and advice specifically for beginners, that are looking for a path, assuming that they know very little about all the different types of paths, and just kind of want to get on something and start moving in that direction. What would some of your advice for them specifically be?
Maybe I give a book recommendation that's very concise and very speaks to the beginner, and also gives you an overview of what this work is like. And that's one of the greatest works, and you can find it for free online to download it. It's called The Progress of Insight, and it's written by Mahasi Sayadaw, and he has written this basically as an instruction to his students, and he's also in there describing the phases that you are going to get to and that you are going to go through along this way, and it's very clear. So whenever you are finding yourself at this point of saying, okay, I want to go take this meditation beyond the 3-minute stress reduction, productivity enhancing thing that it's sold for nowadays, then that's a great entry point. And maybe to wrap it up from what we said in the beginning, meditation is about seeing clearly. And so every time you are questioning what should you do, how should you meditate, choose an object of meditation. As we said, you can choose the rising and falling sensations of the stomach, and just watch those repeatedly. And what will happen is that when you are labeling those inside your mind silently, you say rising when the stomach is rising and falling when the stomach is falling. It sounds simple, but you will learn a lot of things, because the mind is active. It will start to distract you. It will happen hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of times during your meditation practice, that you are getting lost in thought, and you are going to pull yourself back, and you are going to recognize and say, oh, that's thinking. And then feelings will come up, sensations in the body, where you say pain or pressure or itching, and you just recognize the sensations arising in the moment. That's the practice in the beginning, and it's the practice till the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Some just other stuff that comes to my mind is there's this debate about when you're getting into the quote unquote spiritual world. There's so many different options, so many different paths. Every major religion has within it a mystical and spiritual branch and element that one can follow. And I could see why, somebody raised in a Christian culture might find Christian mysticism to be more of an entryway and speak more to them than perhaps Buddhism, or somebody in an Islamic culture might choose Sufism as opposed to Buddhism or whatever it may be. Is there anything to the idea that one should find a tradition and stick with it? Or are you somebody who says that actually Buddhist meditation in particular is the most effective and laid out spiritual path to take, and other paths might be a little bit more vague or, harder to follow? Or what's your take on that idea of finding one tradition and sticking to it, especially as opposed to the buffet approach of pulling and pushing away different things based on your own preferences and kind of hobbling them together into one, worldview or whatever it may be?
Yeah, with the caveat that I have limited experience with some of the major religions like Christianity. I haven't really dove into their practices, but from my general understanding, and I've talked to some people, I have some religious friends, and really the problem with those is that they don't have a great emphasis on practice. You will probably not find very many Catholics that are going beyond conceptualizing.
Right.
They are going to speak to you about the results basically and give you rules to live by, and then it's going to come from the mind. But maybe there are some traditions within these religions that are more practice-based, but really from all my research, and I have also tried a lot of spiritual practices, the Buddhist practices are really the most direct, the most thought out, and even you could say sophisticated, even though the application is very simple, but it's really, I don't think it's surpassed by any other religion. And so if you want to go the safe route, just stick with what works.
Mm-hmm. But even within Buddhism, let's say, there's a Zen Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism or, Vajrayana Buddhism, or, you can have an attachment to the aesthetics of Tibetan culture, and maybe that's your doorway in. So even within Buddhism, there's many different paths. And is there an idea that maybe just, there's one Dharma and you can take any door into it, but it leads to the same place? Or like, actually it is helpful to start like just with one Buddhist tradition in particular and kind of stick with that instead of bouncing around to different teachers and communities and sects and traditions?
Yeah, probably, and that's my experience, this is going to happen anyways for most people when they start. It's like natural. You want to understand, you want to see what's out there, you want to read different things, and that's where this idea of when you find something that clicks and that feels genuinely like, okay, I'm going to trust that this teaching is right and that what they say is genuine, then there is benefit of sticking to that. And in the end, the objects of meditation, the styles can differ, but what the practice is doing, what you are doing, and what the results are, that's not different. So whatever helps you to see clearly the sensations arising in the moment, for you, that's helpful. And maybe you prefer certain styles, like reciting mantras, which is then something you concentrate repeatedly on a verbal pattern in your thoughts, or whether that's something you see, something you work with within the visual field, or within your emotional field, whether you, as you mentioned earlier, when you work with love, for example, then that's like, in the end, you realize those are minor details, as long as the practice or the tradition keeps you focused on the reality arising each moment. There are different things you can choose from and different things achieve that goal.
Yeah, well said. And I would just also add to that is like having this approach of curiosity as opposed to treating it as like another chore you have to do to make yourself better. Like I need to exercise and I need to get enough sleep and I should also meditate because I'm trying to, do self-improvement. That's fine as far as it goes. But this idea of just being very curious and having that as your main posture when you're engaging in this stuff and studying this stuff can be very helpful. People listening to a show like this are obviously curious about the external world. They're very curious about how it works, different ways of interpreting it, how to change it, so there's a natural inclination there to be curious and to investigate, and that exact same approach and posture can and I think should be applied to one's inner life, one's mental and emotional behavioral patterns. And there's nothing that I've come across superior to Buddhism when it comes to being very clear about, how to do this. And so I think that helps just in general, treating it with curiosity and openness and investigation as opposed to treating it as yet another self-improvement task or chore that you have to check off your list every day, because you can really kill the practice by treating it like that. At least I found that to be true in my experience. And then the other thing is a healthy dose of self-compassion can be very helpful. A lot of people have no problem expressing compassion towards others, but a lot of people, especially in certain cultures like the one I live in, self-hatred, self-loathing, not feeling worthy enough is certainly predominant. And, you can engage in these practices and then start to become very harsh with yourself, start to judge yourself. You're not doing this right enough. You're not making progress enough. That person is doing better than you. Oh, you're being sloppy. Sit down and shut up. And, that approach, that little tyrant, that little Nazi in your mind that wants to whip you every time, you do something wrong, and self-flagellate, kind of gently try to let go of that as well, because it won't serve you in these practices. And I found that to be truly compassionate and loving of the other, I have to develop that love and compassion and respect for myself, alongside it, if not prior to it. And that's at least been my experience. Do you have any thoughts on that as a sort of final say, or any final words in general?
Yeah, whenever you think the thought, how can I, or how can I, and then usually it's like, how can I achieve this, get this, make this happen? You can realize whenever that's going through your mind, oh, I'm already in the illusion. And then when you really believe that there is still this I that can do this or that or be better than someone else, or then you're operating not from the level of mindfulness but from the level of illusion. And in terms of practice, that's always a good thing to keep in mind, that when this terminology you use in your thoughts and conceptualize them, it's already mindful, it's a thought,
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I always love having you on. I definitely am going to have you back on because we still have about half of this outline to work through.
Yeah.
But I really, really do appreciate you coming on. And I reached out to you outside of the show and just asked you for some advice, and you were so willing and so willing to give that advice to me. It really meant a lot. And I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Before I let you go, can you just let listeners know where they can find you and your YouTube channel online and anything else you might want to plug?
Yeah, as you said that, I want to mention that I really, as I see the benefits of this work within myself, I really love sharing this and love to help people on this journey. And so people can find me on my website, lauritzm.com. And you can also find a link to my YouTube channel there and information about me. I also offer coaching, which is just provided on a donation basis. So everyone who listens to this and maybe has some questions about their practice or feels that this resonates with them and they want to learn more, know more, they can really feel free to contact me through my website. I also have there the little calendar where you can automatically book a session with me, and we talk about your stuff. People usually start to explain their situation to me, and then I give them my input, and we figure out the next steps for them and how practice can go forward. And so, yeah, that's what I do kind of full time now. It's started as a passion. Now I'm doing it to help people, and I'm really happy that people are coming to me and find some inspiration from what I did and on the YouTube channel, as you also did. So that's my offer to people.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll link to all of that in the show notes so people can find you as easily as possible. And I'll also link to, as I said in the beginning, our previous episode that we did together. If you like this conversation and want to learn more or want to hear that other episode, it'll be in the show notes as well, so you can easily find it. Thank you again, my friend, and let's absolutely do it again soon.
Yeah, thank you as well. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it, and I'm also looking forward to our next conversation.